Hello, Year 13. We're going to begin our study of the post-1945 period with a classic short story by a very influential writer called Graham Greene. And the short story is called The Destructors. It's quite a shocking story in a way because it deals with things like youth vandalism and youth anger. Coming out of the post-war period, a lot of people wanted change. They looked at Britain, they looked across Europe, and they saw a continent in ruins. They looked at their ruling class and they looked at the elite, and many people wanted change. Graham Greene wrote this short story because he saw it as allegorical of the state of Britain. And in this short lecture, I'm going to be explaining to you how the symbolism in this story is very important to our course, because the whole idea of post-1945 fiction is that there is a kind of attack on Western culture and on authority. And we're going to trace many of these forms of rebellions throughout the period that we study. And this seems to me a superb story to begin with, and one that we will interweave throughout the themes that we look at. And in this lecture, and in the next lesson that you have, we will be applying the context of post-war Britain to the story The Destructors. And this context, or AO3, will definitely help you. Before the next lesson, after you've listened to this lecture, I would like you to annotate the extracts on The Destructors. And I would like you also to look at the second section of the lesson, which concerns symbolism. Moving on. The questions that we will be asking ourselves are, how does the angry young man emerge from the landscape of post-war Britain? And I'll be telling you about this literary phenomenon of the angry young man, as the phrase suggests, a young man who turns on society, who feels rage. In many cases, the angry young man is not able to define why he is so angry, but just feels the state of rage, anger, and ennui. We'll be looking a lot at social class, and we will be examining why this is so important. It's particularly important in British literature. We'll also be looking at American literature, but social class there doesn't play quite such an important role. And finally, we're going to be looking at this very philosophical question: to what extent can there be creation in destruction? Are these two things opposites, or can destruction actually lead to a new world, to new ideas? And when you look at the themes and the plot of The Destructors, I think you'll understand why I consider this to be perhaps the most important of our learning questions. In particular, then, we're going to begin by looking at the context and the characters in our story, The Destructors. But first, a little bit more on Graham Greene, because it's very important that we understand this writer. And I'll draw your attention to this excellent web page over here, which you can have a look at in your own time if you want to find out more about Graham Greene, because he's a writer that you can reference, especially when you're talking about AO4, the idea of typicality, and the idea of classic storylines, which are then picked up intertextually by other writers. Now, he was an English novelist, a short story writer, a playwright, and a journalist. A brilliant man in many ways who wrote very widely about things. Many of his stories were very, very pessimistic, partly based on a very Roman Catholic idea of the world, the idea of God's grace, mercy, but also there are popular fiction elements in his writing, a lot of adventure, a lot of suspense. He loved the espionage, the spy thriller novel, and he wrote a huge variety of genres, even comedy at times. He also, in the Second World War, worked in intelligence, and that's quite interesting because that's going to link to ideas of film noir that we'll study later on in the course, so try to remember that. And many of his books have been made into films. In fact, he's one of the most successful novelists in terms of his books being adapted for cinema. And many people argue that he actually wrote with cinema in mind. Unfortunately, he did suffer from a bipolar disorder, which helps to explain the fact that many of his books are extremely pessimistic. And they also involve quite a lot of suicide and violence. Again, these these themes make his books quite controversial, and some people find him just too dark, and some of his books just too pessimistic for their taste. Now, after the war, London and Britain in general had gone through what we call the Blitz. This was extremely heavy bombing by the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. Of course, the British had bombed Germany even worse, so we shouldn't forget that. But the point being is that London in particular lay in ruins, and this is the setting for our story. Have a look at this photo because it will give you an idea of the setting of our story. Our story will concern a car park and one particular beautiful house which miraculously survives the bombing. So I want you to imagine that you are a child growing up in post-war Britain. This is the landscape that would have greeted you every day. You would have seen the ruins of your culture. In particular, the Germans often targeted areas of outstanding beauty. They did this because by destroying the culture and heritage of a country, they hoped to demoralize the country and bomb that country into submission. In the case of Britain, it didn't work, but it wreaked a terrible toll on the country. So I want you to think of this very dark mise-en-scène, ruined buildings, people literally living in rubble. And this is the setting for our story, The Destructors. Here is a picture as well reminding you that many civilians died during the Second World War. Here's a civilian casualty being taken out of the rubble. This may be a male relative of hers. There's a look of horror. It was ordinary civilians who cleared these houses. So if you grew up in the post-war years, violence and horror were part of your experience. And of course, there were many soldiers returning from war, suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, which at the time they wouldn't have recognized. There would have been maimed and disfigured people. There would have been orphans, and there would have been people suffering a great deal of trauma in this background. Remarkably, I love this photo. This is Christopher Wren, who I'll talk to you about in a moment. He was Britain's greatest architect of all time, and possibly Britain's greatest building is St. Paul's Cathedral, magnificent cathedral in London. Now, if you look at this photo, you will see that the bombs hit everywhere around St. Paul's Cathedral. But in the Second World War, St. Paul's actually became a symbol of British resistance because it lasted and somehow remained there in spite of all the thousands of tons of bombs. Now, it's very important because in some ways we define our culture and our history through symbols like St. Paul's, and this is going to be a very important theme in our story, The Destructors. Christopher Wren lived from 1632 to 1723. As I say, an extraordinary architect, and many of the buildings he built were possible because he built after the Great Fire of London in 1666. These houses and churches and buildings are absolutely treasured in Britain. As I say, many people would consider him Britain's greatest architect. And that's why the fact that the house that the boys are going to attack and destroy in the story is a house of invaluable architectural history. It defines English heritage. It is a thing of great beauty. Here's the interior of a Christopher Wren house. This is a house that's still in existence. I chose this picture because it gave me an idea of what the house in The Destructors might have looked like inside. I suspect it was far more unkempt than this because it had gone through the wall, but you can see the idea of a beautiful staircase, the idea of fireplaces that are carved, and no doubt there would have been many beautiful ornaments and chandeliers in the interior of the house in which the story is set. However, very interestingly, even though you have the splendid house, the character Mr. Thomas, or Old Misery as the boys call him, uses an outside toilet or privy. This seems very characteristic to me of post-war London. You have this magnificent house, but the pipes in it are broken, so if you need to relieve yourself, you had to go outside. This toilet's going to be very important because in the story, the boys choose to make Mr. Thomas a prisoner in the toilet. There's something very cruel about that because you can imagine the plumbing wasn't very nice. So sleeping in that stench couldn't have been a very enjoyable experience for poor old Mr. Thomas. Another thing that I want to point out is that in the post-war period, it wasn't all doom and gloom, because as I'm going to show you in a moment, there was a new Labour government determined to raise living standards for the poor, determined to have a better society, a more just society. One of the key things that they set about doing immediately was improving transportation. And that's why the bus features in this particular story. And each day the boys are able to take the bus. I'm going to suggest to you that this shows this kind of new improvement in Britain and the fact that there is a kind of socialist impulse to make it a better society. It's something, interestingly, though, that the boys actually abuse. Now, redevelopment. This is a huge theme in Britain. Some people feel that it's an absolutely terrible thing. Other people feel that it was inevitable. Anyway, we know that after the Blitz, London lay in ruins. And some architects who believed in more modern architecture, would knock down old Victorian buildings, some even earlier, and replace them with much more form follows function, council flats, and buildings that were built cheaply and without decoration. And this really divides British opinion. Some people see this as disgusting new architecture that destroys the country and erases heritage. Other people see it as more democratic, trying to give normal people homes that are comfortable to live in, that are modern, that have electricity and plumbing, etc. This is an important theme because, in a sense, Trevor, the protagonist in the novel, and possibly the villain, you may see him as a villain, is someone who sets about destroying the old England. Does this mean that he wants a new world? Or is he simply a vandal who likes smashing beautiful things? Well, that's a very, very interesting question for us to consider as we read the story. I also want to tell you that well into the 1950s, food was rationed. During the war, food was particularly rationed. But even after the war, there wasn't enough food for people simply to go to the shops. So people had ration books. And I produced this picture because I wanted you to see how much food you had a week. This is food for a week, guys. 1 egg, couple of slices of bacon, bit of butter, cheese, cooking fat, tea, margarine, and not too much sugar in your tea. You can see the amount of meat that you were given a week was hardly generous. So we need to think about, again, the society in which Trevor and the Wormsley gang are operating is a society of deprivation, where people have very, very few luxuries at all. Now, very interestingly, after the war, Winston Churchill was voted out of office. Winston Churchill was the son of an aristocrat, an extremely wealthy and influential man from a top elite family. I think you can tell from his cigar and bow tie and his tux that he was a man who stood for the aristocracy. He stood for elitism. He was a scholar of Harrow and Cambridge himself. He was a great historian, a very learned man. And he was very popular in the Second World War because he was seen as resisting and defying the Nazis and being a great wartime leader. However, after the war, he was elected from office, and Clement Attlee, the Labour Prime Minister, replaced him. And many people saw this as the end of the old elite world and the beginning of a more democratic and fair world that would actually look at the lot of the common man. This man is the darling of the socialist left and the darling of the Labour Party to this day. His name is Nye Bevan. He was a Welshman. His father had been a miner, and he was the person who presided over the birth of the National Health Service. This was an extraordinary idea, the idea that every single person in Britain could have equal access to health, including women having babies for the first time, the idea that nobody would suffer from sickness without having access to healthcare and medicine was a new idea. So in post-war Britain, as I said, there was a kind of positive side to it, which was this determination to improve living standards, education, and healthcare for absolutely everybody. And this seems to me part of this idea that no more would there be a Britain that was simply for the haves, for the elites. in which only wealthy people could have access to healthcare and education. It seemed to be this notion that we could have a fairer and more democratic society. And this is possibly one way that we can read the story of Trevor, who, as we know, goes on to burn Mr. Thomas's money and destroy his elite house. Is this part of this rebellion against wealth and privilege? Another thing that's very interesting, of course, is we see that Britain still has an empire after the Second World War, but it is an empire in absolute decay. In Asia, Britain was absolutely humiliated and defeated by the Japanese, and many Asian people found it very hard to forgive Britain because they'd followed them and they'd been led by them. But when the Japanese arrived, they were defeated very quickly, and the Japanese treated them incredibly cruelly in places like Singapore and Malaysia, and really the local people never forgave them and never accepted colonial rule again. It was certainly the case as well. Indian soldiers had fought for the British in the Second World War, and many of them felt that they'd earned independence. So why am I telling you this? Well, I think Britain, at the end of the war, was a confused country. It had been the greatest empire, the largest empire the world had ever seen. Now it was a reluctant empire. It was a ruined country in economic terms, a country that didn't have money to sustain an empire any longer. And it was going to go from this huge empire owning all of this territory to this small bit of land here. And in many ways, Britain went through a kind of existential crisis where it didn't really know who it was. And some people were really angered by this, and they found it very hard to give up on the empire. Other people who tended to come more from a socialist perspective wanted to free the empire and to give them independence as quickly as possible. So this will be a very important theme in our story, but right throughout our post-1945 period. Finally, in your next lesson, you will also look at this idea of the angry young man. I want to point out that a big literary archetype, a very common character in literature, is the idea of the angry young man. This here is a film based on the very famous play by a playwright called John Osborne, and it's called Look Back in Anger. It is about, as it suggests, a very angry young man, Jimmy Porter. He rails against Britain. He doesn't know why he's angry. He's very articulate. He's intelligent. He's frustrated though, and he doesn't know what to do with all of this energy. And we call this new genre in theatre kitchen sink realism. And what it's going to do is it's going to be more honest about things like sexuality. It's going to be more honest about things like domestic violence. It's going to examine some of the things that literature didn't dare look at in the past. And so one of the big themes for us in this course will be looking at how censorship is challenged and eventually defeated. Now, I hope that this has given you some very good cultural context that is going to help you see the story, The Destructors, in more detail. I think you are going to enjoy the story a great deal. And don't forget that when you use cultural detail, AO3 context, it must be integrated and not bolted on. And that's something that we're going to be practicing a great deal in this lesson. Thank you for listening.